Greetings all, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to continue our conversation around chord durations. This is part 2 of a 3-part series. Hopefully you had a chance to take a look at part 1, which will give us some fundamentals that we'll be building on. And with that, we'll jump right in. So first part, we looked at chord duration itself in terms of how this setting impacted the playback of chords that you had in your various sections. So today we're going to look at what chord duration, or how that chord duration setting impacts when you're working with in perform mode. So first thing I want to do is I want to load some chords. It'll take make things a little bit quicker for us here. So there's 2 fundamentals I want to get across on this one. I guess one's a build on the first video, and that is this idea that these chord blocks you see here are basically little packets of Midi. Okay, I can drag that Midi to my desktop, I can drag it to the DAW, I can do things with it. As soon as I apply a performance setting, any of the Midi associated with that particular performance setting, for the most part, is written immediately to the chord. So now, play this chord and I get those Midi notes. If I drag that chord up here, I see those Midi notes in my DAW. Now what I also see, what this brings to my attention here, is potentially a pattern, potentially a repeat. So if I look in here, double click, look at my piano roll, there's a symmetric pattern, pretty easy to see. This particular sequence plays the chord on the turnaround, or at the beginning of each of its patterns. So if I listen to it, if I just hold my chord down, I'll hear the turnaround. It's pretty easy to spot. Okay, so let's say I want to bump that up, and or let me rephrase that. Let's say that I want to listen to a more complex chord or complex pattern. Then I might not find it so easy to hear that or find that turnaround. So in this case, we're going to take a look at Doppio. Oh, let me talk about how this is set up down here. So what I've done down here at the bottom, just to make things easier, I use this when I'm searching for chord lengths and so forth, is set up 4 chords, the same chord, just makes it easier to hear the turnarounds and the repeats. And each one of these chords is set up with a different playback duration. So this is set to 0.5, 1, 2x, 4x. As we remember from part 1, these all connect to this value right here. I set this at the max, which is 16 beats. Okay, 16 beats is the max. I set it there, and then I cut it down. I cut the first one in half. I use the first one to cut that in half, so that gives me 8 beats. 0.5 times 16 gives me 8 beats. So if I want to see the first 8 beats of this chord, I can drop it in here. Okay, actually, let me change and move over to Doppio for a second. So, no, actually, I'm going to stick with global since we already looked at that. So the first one is those 8 beats. We talked about the symmetry, or the symmetric pattern, right? So there's our initial pattern. We double that. There's our repeat. Okay, we can continue that out. 16 of them, or I'm sorry, 32 of them for that, and then all the way out to 64. Now, not particularly helpful when we have a fairly simple pattern to work with. But as they get more complex, it becomes a more useful tool. So let's jump into Doppio for a second. And if we listen to Doppio, I'll just hold it down. See that C on the end? That tells me that this pattern runs out a little bit longer than it might appear at the beginning. So also, one thing you can do is you can keep an eye on your piano, or on your virtual piano. You can watch your notes there. That's a little quick. Let's speed this. Let's slow this down. Well, about 100 or so is a little better. So now, there we go. There's the G. There's the E. There's a G again. So I'm thinking, oh, maybe it turns around. Nah, now it goes all the way up to C. So if I take a look at this, let's pull my first 8, remember, 0.5 times 16. So there's my first 8. I don't see any kind of repeat there yet. Kind of looks like it might repeat, but you can tell that those 2 notes are different height, so that's definitely not it. And we can hear it, it's pretty obvious. Here it is again, right? So there's that, there's that, maybe that G, that C we heard at the end. So what I'm probably going to get is a repeat here. There we go. So now we can see what looks to be a pretty symmetric repeat. And if we bring in 64, we see that even more. Now, again, sometimes listening is your best friend here, sometimes looking, and sometimes it's a combination of both. And then let's take a look at something a little more complex. Let's take a listen to riffs S, right? It's a 32-bit pattern, or beat pattern. We listen to it. There, in that drop, then we pretty obvious turnaround. So again, we can look at it. We'll just we'll just jump in. Let's pull the. So there's 16. There's that drop, and there's 64. Right. So there's that repeating pattern. So the listening sometimes is the easiest way. Like I said, sometimes listening, sometimes watching. A lot of times it's a combination of both, depending upon what you're trying to do. And if you start getting into some of the even more complex patterns, or patterns that are less rhythmic, it can be even more challenging. So let's jump up to theme J, 64 as an example. And let's, again, we pull, the first 8 beats looks like that. 16 beats look like that. Still no repeat, still no repeat, and still no repeat, right? So we're at 64, we still don't see a repeat. If I would use MIDI capture or some other method, I might be able to confirm that this actually ends at 64 beats. I'm not 100% confident that's the case, but for the most part, it is usually the case. You will find some of the patterns or some of the sequences. I'm sorry, I'm using different terms back and forth here. I don't think there's a global term for all the things that scalar can play when it relates to its patterns and performances and so forth. So I'll call them sequences, or try to. There are some that actually have trailing, or the end of the sequences actually blank notes, right? So, for example, you'll find some patterns that the last note ends at 48 beats, but the timing really wants that extra, 24, 64, 48, 58, 60, extra 16, extra 16 beats, just for the timing of the pattern. And unfortunately, when you drag that into your DAW, what that ends up doing many times is creating a pattern that's 48 beats long. And then if you're running that up against another pattern or another element that is 64 beats or some other variation, you may be out of sync. So just be aware of that. The blanks at the end will have an impact. So anyway, I don't mean to ramble there. So that gives you a sense of how the various perform modes. We're not going to go through all of them. We'd be here for hours. There's hundreds and hundreds of them, if not more. But they have some variation in them. And this is a way to better understand what those variations are and know how to make sure you're not leaving notes on the table that might be useful for you. A couple other little tidbits prior to getting into version 3 or part 3 of this discussion is, well, why might you want to use this besides just trying to understand what the various chord or sequence lengths are? Well, there's a couple different reasons that come to mind, and there are others, but the first one is allowing you to visualize or visually identify potential sequence pieces that could work for you based on what you're trying to do. So for example, we have these loaded, so we'll just go ahead and use these as an example. Remember that riffs pattern? Let's pull the 16 version or the 32-bit version of that, 32-beat version of that. Let's say we were working on something and we wanted something that had this drop, right? That kind of this downward progression here. That sounded kind of interesting. So let's open that MIDI part up. And let's say this piece right here is what we want. So we're not interested in these. We want to move these, and we want those guys to be, and we just want that. And then we just want to grab and just play. This just sets the play length of this particular MIDI chord in this DAW, a MIDI sequence. And that's what we want. All right, so something sound kind of weird there? Yeah, it did. Why am I getting those weird notes? Well, if you guess that my perform mode was still turned on, you get a gold star. Exactly. So in some cases, when you drive a scalar perform mode of some kind, it could be anything, performances, arpeggios, any of these elements, when you drive these with notes from scale that you also derived from scalar, right? In other words, you've drug a piece of scalar or a chord from scalar that has perform information on it. You've drug it up to your DAW. Now you're using that to drive scalar. So if I hit play on this piece of MIDI, the way scalar is set up, it will play these notes, just like we got when we in riffs. All right, so same stuff, so this is driving from within scalar, this is driving scalar from the outside. So when you take MIDI that was created inside of scalar and you drive scalar with that MIDI, you can get some pretty interesting things. In our case, it's pretty simple right now. All right, there we go, we've got that. If we turn perform on this one, it doesn't really work, right? So we get some overlapping notes. Sometimes it's much, much worse than others, but sometimes it actually works. As an example of that is, let's take a look at, let's go to Vivace, Da Capo, and if we listen to that, take that, and let's go ahead and pull that MIDI string into our DAW. So that's our MIDI. And if we turn off our perform and we play this, we get exactly what we expected. What happens, however, if we turn perform on this one? There you go. So now you actually have a clean playback that has just been moved up an octave or so. And I can toggle back and forth. So what this demonstrates is, in some cases, a performance in scalar, when it's fed back into itself, creates what I call performance voicings. Not always, but sometimes. And with creative use of quantize and some playback speeds, you can take many times performances that sounded terrible and get some really interesting stuff out of them. I can also run them into other performances. So for example, let's say, I'm gonna just goof around here, not exactly sure what we're gonna find, but there will be something probably. So let's just go to the basic here for a second. Again, as a reminder, this is what this sounds like. And if we run that through, there's another voicing, effectively, that we get out of basic performance. Now, as this is running, we can cycle or begin to walk through these settings. Some will be interesting, some not necessarily. But what you will find, no doubt, is some pretty interesting stuff. So you can start with one set of performances and by feeding them back into other performances, pull some pretty interesting things. So with that, I will wrap this part up. Ran a little longer than we expected, but hopefully it gives you an introduction into what is effectively part 3. We're also going to get into play quantize, which again is still connected to our chord duration information, or working with chord duration. But we're starting to move closer and closer to thinking about scalar kind of like you might think about a synthesizer, when you're feeding various pieces of a synth back into itself and getting some pretty interesting and fun things. So until then, hope this helped a little bit. Enjoy making music, have fun with scalar, and we'll talk to you sometime in the future.